The millionaire's daughter was washing dishes at 3 a.m. He had hired her without knowing. It was almost 3 in the morning when the pendulum clock in the upstairs hallway chimed, a deep, solitary sound that reverberated through the cold walls of Edward Ashton's mansion. Manchester, outside, was enveloped in one of those dense, damp fogs, typical of autumn, which transformed the streets of Didsbury into an almost cinematic scene of shadows and diffused lights. But inside the house, the atmosphere was one of absolute silence, a quietness that weighed more than the air itself. Edward was awake, again. At 58, he was the image of success to those who saw him on the covers of business magazines or in the city's social columns. One of the most influential entrepreneurs in the region, owner of an empire in the logistics and infrastructure sector, Edward had built his life with the precision of an architect and the coldness of a chess player. Nothing in his trajectory had been left to chance. Every merger, every acquisition, every handshake had been calculated to lead him exactly where he was, at the top. But the top, he had discovered too late, was a cold and above all silent place. Insomnia was not new. It had become a faithful companion. For the past 5 years, ever since the divorce was finalized and his children, already adults, moved to Europe to manage the branches, an elegant euphemism for distancing themselves from their demanding father's shadow. That night, however, the lack of sleep had a different taste, a restlessness that did not come from worries about the Japanese investors arriving the next morning, nor from the dollar fluctuations that so concerned his board of directors. It was something more visceral, a feeling of emptiness that seemed to expand in his chest, occupying the space where once ambition had resided. He got out of the king-size bed, the disheveled Egyptian cotton sheets bearing witness to his silent struggle against wakefulness. He put on a navy blue silk robe over his pajamas and slipped on his slippers, feeling the material comfort that, ironically, brought him no spiritual comfort. He walked to the large glass window that occupied the entire wall of the bedroom. The double glazing insulated the sound of the wind outside, but he could see the tops of the ancient pines in the garden swaying, tall old ghosts guarding his property. "Damn head," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse in the last few hours. He decided to go downstairs. Perhaps a glass of water or maybe a whiskey would help calm the thoughts that spun non-stop. He opened the bedroom door and entered the hallway. The house was vast, decorated with an elegant minimalism that bordered on impersonality. Works of art by acclaimed regional artists adorned the walls, illuminated by spotlights that remained on all night, as if the house were afraid of the dark. He descended the travertine marble staircase slowly, his hand gliding along the cold banister. Each step seemed an echo of his own solitude. He thought about tomorrow's meeting. The investors wanted guarantees about the port expansion. He had the numbers, he had the projections, he had everything under control. So why did he feel he was losing something fundamental? Perhaps it was age. The approach of 60 brought with it questions he had always judged to be clichés of midlife crises, but which now knocked at his door with the force of an undeniable truth. Upon reaching the ground floor, the living room opened into a vastness of leather sofas and Persian rugs. Everything was impeccable. The cleaning staff, coordinated by a rigorous housekeeper, kept the house in a state of almost surgical perfection. There wasn't a book out of place, a crumpled cushion, a speck of dust. It was a magazine house, not a home. Edward crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the carpets, heading towards the kitchen. It was then that he heard it, a subtle sound, the faint clinking of glass against glass. Then, the unmistakable sound of running water, but with low pressure, as if someone was trying to muffle the noise. Edward stopped. His heart skipped a beat, not from fear but from alert. The house's security system was state-of-the-art. No one entered there unnoticed. If there was someone in the kitchen, it was someone from inside. But at this hour, the housekeeper, Mrs. Matilda, slept in the annex at the back and was a heavy sleeper. The other staff, gardeners, drivers, security guards, did not have access to the main house at night, except in emergencies. He walked more carefully now, the predator's instinct he used in business taking over. He approached the sliding door that separated the dining room from the gourmet kitchen. The door was ajar, letting out a sliver of yellowish, light different from the white clinical light that usually illuminated that room. Edward peeked through the crack. The scene he saw paralyzed him for a moment, not by threat, but by its strangeness. In the kitchen, under the dim light of the stove's extractor fan, the only light on in the vast room, a female figure stood at the sink. It was a young woman. Her back to him, she looked small, almost fragile, swallowed by the grandeur of the fitted cabinets and black granite countertops. She wore the light grey uniform of the new outsourced company Matilda had hired the previous week to reinforce the cleaning. The uniform seemed a little too big for her, or perhaps it was she who had grown too thin for it. She was washing a pile of dishes with a dedication that bordered on obsession. There weren't many pieces, a few dessert plates, wine glasses he didn't even remember using, silver cutlery, but the way she washed caught Edward's attention. She soaped each piece slowly, turning it in her hands, rinsed with a minimal stream of water to avoid making noise, and immediately dried it with a tea towel, as if she wanted to erase any trace that the dishes had once been dirty. Edward watched her in silence. There was something in her posture, a tension in her shoulders, her head slightly bowed, her movements quick and nervous whenever an external noise, the refrigerator's hum, the wind outside, broke the silence. She was afraid. He tried to recall. Had he seen that girl before? Perhaps a glimpse in the hallways carrying buckets or vacuum cleaners. But the faces of outsourced employees, he admitted with a pang of guilt, often blended in his mind. They were cogs that made the house run, invisible presences he paid not to notice. But there at that hour, under that dramatic light, she was impossible to ignore. Her brown hair was tied in a loose bun, from which a few rebellious strands escaped and fell on her neck. Her skin was pale, contrasting with the grey of the uniform. Edward felt an unusual curiosity. What was a young employee doing there at 3 in the morning, furtively washing dishes as if committing a crime? He decided to enter. He pushed the sliding door. The roller, however well lubricated, emitted a deep sound. As it slid open, the girl's reaction was immediate and visceral. She spun around with a jolt, her wet, soapy hands clutching a crystal glass against her chest, as if it were a shield. Her body tensed, her eyes wide with genuine panic. The glass slipped from her trembling fingers. Time seemed to slow down. Edward saw the crystal fall, spinning in the air, catching the yellow light of the extractor fan. He waited for the shatter, the noise that would wake the whole house. But the girl, with impressive reflexes, moved her foot and cushioned the fall of the glass with the instep of her cheap canvas trainer, before quickly bending down and catching it before it touched the floor. She straightened up, breathless, holding the intact glass, and looked at him. It was at that moment that Edward felt the first real impact. Her eyes. They were large, brown, deep, but they were surrounded by purplish, dark circles of someone who hadn't slept well for a long time. And in them, there was a fear he didn't often see. It wasn't the fear of an employee caught slacking off. It was the fear of a cornered prey, the fear of someone with something very valuable to hide. "Mr. Ashton?" Her voice came out as a failed whisper. She immediately lowered her head, avoiding eye contact, her shoulders hunched. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. I just—" she stammered, her trembling hands placing the glass on the countertop with excessive care. Edward remained standing at the kitchen entrance, his hands in his robe pockets, analyzing the scene. His naturally imposing posture seemed to occupy the entire space, but he made a conscious effort to soften his expression. "You didn't wake me," he said, his voice calm, deep, filling the silence. "I was already awake. Insomnia." He entered the kitchen, walking slowly to the central island. The girl recoiled a step, leaning against the sink, as if she wanted to merge with the tiles and disappear. "What's your name?" he asked, stopping at a respectful distance. She hesitated. Edward saw her throat move in a dry swallow. "Louisa, sir. Louisa." He tested the name. It sounded common, simple. "You work for the new company, right? Cleanstream?" "Yes, sir, I started last week. And is it part of your duties to wash dishes at 3 in the morning, Louisa?" The question was not accusatory, but it carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Louisa flinched. She looked at the pile of dishes, then at her own hands, red from the cold water and detergent. "No, sir, it's just that—" She took a deep breath, searching for an explanation. "I saw that the dinner dishes were left. Mrs. Matilda was tired, went to bed early, and I couldn't sleep. I thought it would be good to get ahead of the work, so it wouldn't pile up tomorrow." The lie was obvious. Edward knew Matilda would never leave dirty dishes in the sink. The housekeeper was a maniac for organization. Those dishes probably weren't even dirty, or they were something Louisa herself had used, or— No, that didn't make sense. Why would someone wash clean dishes, or why would someone invent work in the middle of the night? Unless she didn't want to be somewhere else. Unless the kitchen, lit and quiet, was safer than the room she occupied, or than the thoughts that haunted her. Edward looked at the crooked badge pinned to her uniform. Louisa Nolan. The surname sparked. Something deep in his memory, something old, dusty, but he couldn't grasp the connection at that instant. "You're trembling, Louisa," he observed. "It's the cold, sir. Manchester, you know. The central heating is on. The house is at 22 degrees Celsius. She fell silent, caught in the contradiction. She bit her lower lip, a gesture of anxiety that made her seem even younger. Edward estimated she couldn't be more than 23, 24. The age his daughter, Beatrice, was when she moved to London. But Beatrice never had those calloused hands, nor that look of someone expecting a blow at any moment. "Leave it," he ordered softly. "Leave the dishes. Someone will finish them tomorrow." "But sir, it's almost done. That's an order, Louisa." He didn't raise his voice, but the tone was definitive. "Go rest. You need to be fresh tomorrow. And I'm going to get a glass of water." Louisa nodded quickly, drying her hands on her apron with frantic movements. "Yes, sir. Excuse me, sir. Sorry again." She made a slight bow, something old-fashioned he hadn't seen in years, and circled the central island, keeping as much distance from him as possible. Edward followed her, with his gaze as she left the kitchen, her steps quick and silent like a cat fleeing the rain. When she disappeared into the hallway leading to the service area and the staff quarters, Edward let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He went to the cabinet, took a glass and filled it with filtered water. He took a sip, feeling the cool liquid go down his throat, but his mind was far away. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Edward Ashton had built his fortune based on a specific talent, the ability to identify patterns and, more importantly, to notice when a pattern was broken, a number out of place in a balance sheet, a pause too long in a competitor's speech, a diverted gaze in a negotiation. These were the details that told the truth. And Louisa Nolan was a broken pattern. A cleaning employee who spoke cultured English without slang, with perfect diction, even when nervous, who had quick reflexes and a posture that, despite the fear, denoted a certain haughtiness. No, not haughtiness. Dignity. There was a wounded dignity in her, and that gesture of biting her lip, the way she held the glass. He placed the glass in the sink next to the dishes she had left. He looked at the plates. They were Vista Alegre porcelain plates, part of a set he rarely used. Why would she be washing those? He ran a hand over his face, feeling his stubble scratch his palm. The insomnia, which before was just an emptiness, was now filled with a mystery. Nolan. The name echoed in his mind again. Nolan. Where had he heard that surname associated with something familiar? He left the kitchen, turning off the extractor fan light. The house plunged back into semi-darkness, but now the shadows seemed to hide secrets, not just expensive furniture. He went back upstairs to his bedroom but didn't lie down. He went to his private study, a room annexed to the bedroom, panelled in dark wood and filled with bookshelves. He sat in his leather armchair, turned on the table lamp and opened his laptop. The bluish light from the screen illuminated his tired face. He typed Nolan into the search bar of his personal files, but the term was too generic. Contracts with timber suppliers, names of lawyers, addresses appeared. He closed his eyes, trying to visualize the girl's face. The fine features, the straight nose, the curve of the jaw. She reminded him of someone he had known in another life, in another time, when everything was riskier and more alive. He got up and went to a bookshelf, where he kept photo albums and mementos that his ex-wife had insisted on organizing before leaving. He pulled out a heavy album with a brown leather cover, dated 10-12 years ago, the time of Ashton and Nolan logistics. Edward's heart skipped a beat. Ashton and Nolan, how could he forget Robert Nolan, his former partner, the man who had been his best friend and later his greatest disappointment? He urgently flipped through the album, the pages rustling in the pre-dawn silence. Photos of warehouse inaugurations, business dinners, company Christmas barbecues. And there he was. Robert. Tall, expansive, always with a glass in hand and a wide smile, the opposite of Edward's reserved manner. And next to Robert, in a photo taken at a charity dinner at the Manchester Grand Club, was his family. His wife, elegant and sad, and their daughter. Edward brought the album closer to the light. The girl in the photo must have been about 12 or 13. She wore an expensive party dress, her hair long and loose, and looked at the camera with a mixture of boredom and defiance. But her eyes were the same. Large, brown, deep. Louisa Nolan, Robert Nolan's daughter, the heiress to a fortune that turned to dust and scandal. Edward leaned back in the armchair, the album open on his lap, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the house's temperature. Robert Nolan had left his life catastrophically. Embezzlement, tender fraud, a police investigation that almost dragged Edward's company, Dalong. Edward had to cut off his own flesh to save himself, firing his friend, suing him, destroying his reputation to preserve the company's. Robert fled the country, or hid in the countryside. No one knew for sure. It was said he was bankrupt, sick, finished. And now his daughter was in Edward's kitchen, washing dishes at 3 in the morning, wearing a cleaning uniform and trembling with fear. What was she doing there? Was it revenge? Espionage? Or something worse? Was she so desperate as to work for the man who, in the eyes of many, destroyed her father? Edward looked at the photo again. The rich, spoiled, protected girl. And remembered the woman in the kitchen, with hands red from soap and the look of someone who had learned to survive. He closed the album with a dull thud. The night was far from over, and the peace he so sought, he realized with a heavy sigh, was now further away than ever. He needed answers, and, knowing himself, he wouldn't rest until he had them. Edward Ashton stood up, went to the window, and looked at the sleeping city. Somewhere in that immense house, Louisa Nolan was awake, carrying the weight of a surname he had helped bury, and for the first time in years, Edward felt something beyond his own loneliness. He felt curiosity, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of responsibility. The game had changed, and he needed to know the rules. The next morning dawned with that metallic grey that Mancunians knew so well. The sun tried, unsuccessfully, to break through the barrier of low clouds covering the city, casting a diffuse, unheated light over the glass buildings of the Civic Centre. Edward Ashton was in his office on the 20th floor of the Ashton Logistics headquarters, an imposing tower that dominated the landscape. The meeting with the Japanese investors had been a technical success. Numbers approved, schedules adjusted, perfunctory handshakes. But Edward's mind had not been present for a moment. As he spoke about port expansion and railway networks, his thoughts obsessively returned to his home kitchen, to the yellow light of the extractor fan, and to Louisa Nolan's frightened eyes. He dismissed his secretary with a brief nod and spun his chair to face the city view. Manchester looked like a chessboard of grey pieces below. He wondered where she would be now. Probably cleaning a bathroom or sweeping a corridor in his own house, invisible, anonymous. The office door opened after 2 sharp knocks. It was Walter, his personal assistant and trusted man for over 20 years. Walter was a short, bald man, with thick-rimmed glasses and an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. He knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically, of course, and knew how to keep Edward's life running like clockwork. "Mr. Ashton," Walter said, closing the door behind him, "I brought what you asked for." Edward spun his chair back. Walter held a thin brown folder with no external identification. He placed it on the mahogany desk with the delicacy of someone handling explosives. "That was quick," Edward commented, without touching the folder. "You said it was urgent, and considering the surname, I thought it best to do the screening myself without involving the corporate security team." Edward nodded. Walter was discreet. He knew the Nolan name was still radioactive in the corridors of that company. "What did you find?" Walter sat in the chair opposite the desk, crossing his legs. "It's her, Edward. Louisa Maria Nolan, Robert's youngest daughter, 24 years, old." The confirmation, though expected, settled heavily like lead in Edward's stomach. "And what is she doing in my house, Walter?" Edward's voice was low, dangerous. "Did Robert send her? Is it some kind of blackmail? Does he want money?" Walter shook his head negatively. "It doesn't seem to be any of that. In fact, the story is much more complicated." He opened the folder and took out some printed sheets. "Louisa broke with her family almost 2 years ago. She left home the day after her 22nd birthday. She gave up everything, credit cards, car allowance. She even formally refused her maternal grandmother's inheritance, which was in a trust fund. The document is here, a certified copy I obtained from the registry office." Edward took the paper. It was a declaration of renunciation of assets. Louisa's signature was firm, decisive, contrasting with the trembling handwriting of someone signing under duress. "She doesn't use the Nolan surname on anything unofficial," Walter continued. "In work records, she's just Louisa Maria. She worked in a sandwich shop in the city center, then in a clothing store in an outlying neighborhood, and now she's at Cleanstream. The outsourced company didn't make the connection with her father because, well, who would imagine Robert Nolan's daughter applying for a cleaning assistant position? Where does she live?" "In a boarding house in Ancoats. A simple place, single room, shared bathroom. The landlady says she's the perfect tenant, pays on time in cash, makes no noise, receives no visitors." Edward leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The image of the spoiled girl in the photo faded, giving way to something much more complex. "And Robert?" Edward asked. "Does he know about this?" "Hard to say. Robert has been living reclusively on the farm in Stockport since the scandal. Her mother, Mrs. Helen, is admitted to a nursing home in London with severe depression. The family imploded, Edward, and Louisa. It seems she was the only one who tried to walk out of the rubble on her own 2 feet." Edward looked out the window again. The rain had started to fall, thin streaks against the glass. "Is she in need, Walter?" Walter hesitated. "She lives on the edge. Cleanstream's salary is minimal. From what I gathered, she's saving money to pay an old debt of her mother's, something that wasn't included in the judicial freezing, to have Robert's assets. A matter of honor, perhaps, but she eats little, wears second-hand clothes, and it's a hard life, Edward. Very hard for someone who grew up with a chauffeur and holidays in Paris." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't pity. He detested feeling pity. It was respect, perhaps, but mixed with an uncomfortable guilt. He had destroyed her father. Yes, Robert deserved it. Robert had stolen, lied, betrayed everyone's trust. But Louisa was just a child when it all happened. And now she was paying the price for her father's sins, scrubbing the floor of the house of the man who had delivered the coup de grace to her family. "What do you want to do?" Walter asked pragmatically. "I can ask Cleanstream to transfer her, or fire her if you think it's a security risk." "No," Edward replied too quickly. "Don't fire her. Edward, she's a Nolan. If the press finds out that your former partner's daughter is cleaning your toilet, it will turn into a circus. They'll say you're humiliating the girl, that it's revenge." "I'm not humiliating anyone, Walter. I didn't even know it was her until last night. But now you know, and keeping her there is risky. Firing her would be worse. It would be taking away her livelihood for something she didn't do." Edward stood up, pacing the room. "She's trying to survive, Walter, with dignity. Do you have any idea of the strength it takes to do what she did? Leaving home, refusing money, working hard. Most people in her position would be selling stories to tabloids or living off favors. She chose the harder path." Walter observed his boss with curiosity. It had been years since he had seen Edward so emotionally involved with something that wasn't a multi-million-pound contract. So, what's the plan? The plan is to observe. I want to know who she is, Walter, not Robert's daughter, Louisa. I want to know if she's trustworthy, if she has potential. Potential? For what? To be promoted to head of cleaning. Edward stopped by the window, looking at his reflection superimposed on the grey city. I don't know yet, but I'm not going to throw her out on the street. Keep this between us. No one else should know who she is. Talk to the owner of Cleanstream, invent an excuse, say I want her file to be confidential for internal security reasons. Block access to HR. Right. Walter collected the papers and stood up. But Edward, be careful. The past has a funny way of collecting interest, and the Nolan family owes you a lot. Or you owe them, depending on your point of view. Walter left, leaving Edward alone with the sound of the rain and the brown folder on the desk. That night, Edward returned home earlier. The mansion was, as always, impeccable and silent. He dined alone at the 12-seater table, served by Matilda, who commented on the weather and the price of vegetables at the local market. Edward responded monosyllabically, his eyes scanning the shadows of the corridors, looking for a grey figure. He didn't see her. He went up to his room, tried to read a report, tried to watch the news, but the restlessness returned. Insomnia, faithful like a guard dog, posted itself beside his bed. Around 2 a.m, he went downstairs. This time, he didn't go to the kitchen. He went to the library, which had a strategic view of the back garden and the service entrance. He sat in the dark, watching. At 2:30, the service door opened. Louisa came out. She wasn't in uniform. She wore faded jeans, a thick wool coat that seemed 2 sizes too big for her, and a beanie covering her hair. She carried a battered backpack on her back. Edward frowned. Her shift ended at 6 p.m. What was she doing there at that hour? And where was she going? He watched her cross the service yard, walking quickly, huddled against the cold. She went to the side gate, entered the exit code, and walked out onto the street. Edward didn't think. He just acted. He grabbed the keys to a discreet car he kept in the garage, a black armored sedan, driverless, and left. He followed her from a distance. The streets of Didsbury were deserted. Louisa walked along the pavement, looking back from time to time, alert. She walked for about 10 blocks until she reached a night bus stop. Edward stopped the car at the corner, turned off the headlights, and waited. The bus arrived, empty and lit like a ghostly aquarium. Louisa got on. Edward followed the bus. The journey took 40 minutes. The bus crossed the city centre, passed through the more affluent neighbourhoods, and began to enter the south side into areas where public lighting was scarcer, and houses gave way to simple terraced homes and shops closed with iron grates. Louisa got off at a stop in the Portwood neighbourhood. Edward parked far away. He watched her walk to an old boarding house, a 2-story terraced house with peeling paint and a rooms to let sign. She opened the gate with her own key and went inside. Edward stayed there, parked in the car, watching the second-floor window. A light came on. He saw her silhouette move, take off her coat, sit on the edge of a bed he imagined to be narrow and hard. He looked at the car's dashboard. 3:15 in the morning. She had worked all day, stayed in the mansion late, doing what? And now she was there, alone in that tiny room. Why had she stayed in the mansion until that hour? The answer came the next morning, when Edward, pretending to look for a lost document, entered the staff break room, a place he never set foot in. On a corner table, there was a pile of books. Books on law, economics, accounting. They were old, bought in second-hand shops with marked covers, and next to them an open spiral notebook, full of notes written in tiny, organized handwriting. Edward read one of the pages. They were summaries of tax laws, complex, detailed, brilliant. She wasn't just cleaning his house. She was studying. She was using the silence and light of the mansion, perhaps the Wi-Fi that reached the service area, to study while everyone slept. Edward closed the notebook, feeling a knot in his throat. She was trying to rebuild herself, alone, against everything and everyone, using the crumbs of time left to her between scrubbing floors and washing dishes. He left the break room before anyone saw him. He went up to his office and stared at the phone. He could call the university dean, get her a scholarship, smooth her path. He could give her money. He could fix her life with a snap of his fingers. But he remembered her look in the kitchen. The fear, yes, but also the pride. If he offered help now, she would refuse. Or worse, she would flee. She wanted merit. She wanted to prove, to herself and to the world, that she was not just the thief's daughter. Edward decided he would not interfere, not yet. But that afternoon, when Louisa entered the library to dust, thinking he wasn't there, she found something strange. On the coffee table, forgotten, were 3 new books, updated and very expensive editions on tax law and business management. And next to them, a good quality thermos of coffee and a plate of fine biscuits with a simple, unsigned note typed on the computer. For those who need energy in the early hours, knowledge is the only wealth no one can steal. Edward observed. Through the crack in the adjoining office door, he saw Louisa stop. He saw her read the note. He saw her hands tremble. She looked around, startled, but then, slowly, she touched the hard cover of one of the books, as if it were a sacred jewel. She didn't eat the biscuits, but she hugged the book to her chest for a second, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Then she left everything exactly where it was, dusted around it, and left. But that night, when Edward went downstairs at 3 in the morning, the kitchen light was off. But in the break room a sliver of light escaped, and he knew she was there, devouring the books he had left. It was a beginning, a silent dialogue between 2 ghosts inhabiting the same house, but living in opposite worlds. And Edward, for the first time in a long time, felt that the insomnia was worth it. He had something to watch over, something to protect. Absence has a specific weight. For Edward, accustomed to measuring the world in tons of cargo and containers, Louisa's absence in the mansion was surprisingly dense. It started on a rainy Tuesday. Edward came down for breakfast and noticed that the flower arrangement in the entrance hall, which Louisa usually changed discreetly on Monday mornings, was withered. In the library, the books he had forgotten remained in the same millimeter-perfect position, untouched. Dust, the invisible enemy she fiercely fought, began to accumulate on the leather covers of the law editions. On the first day, he thought it was a day off. On the second, the restlessness turned into a flashing red alert in his mind. He called the housekeeper. Matilda, the cleaning girl, at Louisa. Has she not come in today? Matilda, a robust woman who ran the house with an iron fist, sighed, adjusting her apron. No, Mr. Ashton, not yesterday, not today. The company called saying she was absent without justification. It seems they're going to fire her for abandonment of duty if she doesn't show up by tomorrow. A shame. The girl was good, quiet. But you know how these young people are today. No commitment. Edward didn't answer. Matilda's explanation was logical, but wrong. Louisa was not these young people today. She wouldn't quit the job that supported her studies and her survival on a whim. Something had happened. He went to the office but couldn't work. Her image, alone in that boarding house in Portwood, vulnerable, invaded his thoughts. What if she was sick? What if she had been robbed? What if the past somehow had caught up with her? He called Walter. Find out where she is now. 2 hours later, Walter called back. His voice was tense. She's not at the boarding house, Edward. The landlady said she left 2 days ago with a small suitcase and hasn't returned. But I tracked some movement on her national insurance number. An emergency admission at a 24-hour cafe. In the city centre near Piccadilly Gardens. It seems she took extra shifts to cover an urgent debt. Debt? Her mother's clinic. The monthly payment was overdue, and they threatened to transfer Mrs. Helen to the public health service. Louisa needed money fast. The cafe pays daily in cash. Edward felt a wave of heat rise up his neck. Anger. Not at her, but at the situation, at the cruel arithmetic of life that crushed someone who was only trying to do the right thing. Where is this cafe? Cafe on the Square. It's a busy place, Edward, not the kind of environment you frequent. I'm going there. Do you want me to send security? No, I'll go alone. Edward drove his car, ignoring the chauffeur who was waiting for him. The rain fell torrentially, turning Manchester's streets into rivers of shining asphalt. Traffic was chaotic, but he cut through cars with an aggression that was uncharacteristic of him. He arrived at Piccadilly Gardens in the early evening. The cafe on the square was an old establishment with neon lights flickering on the facade, and large windows fogged by the steam from coffee machines and the breath of dozens of customers. It was a refuge for students, night workers, and all kinds of souls wandering the city centre. Edward parked in a prohibited spot, turned on his hazard lights and got out. The cold wind cut across his face, but he barely felt it. He entered the cafe. The noise hit him like a physical wall. Loud conversations, the clinking of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, pop music playing too loudly. The smell was a mixture of burnt coffee, cheese bread, and dampness. He stopped at the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowded room, and then he saw her. Louisa was behind the counter, serving coffees with mechanical speed. She looked exhausted. The cafe uniform, a bright orange polo shirt and a brown apron, was horrible and seemed to drain the little color left in her face. There were deep dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was tied up haphazardly, with strands stuck to her forehead by sweat. Edward watched. He saw her deliver the wrong order to a customer, a man in a cheap suit who was talking loudly on his phone. "I asked for no sugar, girl. Are you deaf or stupid?" The man shouted, pushing the cup back. The coffee overflowed, burning Louisa's hand. She didn't scream. She just hunched her shoulders, in a defensive gesture Edward already knew. "Sorry, sir. I'll change it." "Change nothing. I'm in a hurry." "What shoddy service? Where's the manager?" A short man with an unfriendly face emerged from behind a door. "What's going on here?" "This incompetent spilled coffee on me," the customer lied. The manager turned to Louisa. He didn't ask for her version. He didn't look at her hand, which was red and swollen. "Again, Louisa? That's the second mistake today. If you can't handle the pace, leave. There's a queue of people outside who want this job." Louisa lowered her head. "Sorry, Mr. Martin. It won't happen again. I need this shift, please." The humiliation in her voice was like a stab for Edward. He saw Robert Nolan's daughter, the girl who had grown up in palaces, begging not to be fired from a low-wage job by a man who wasn't worth the dust on her shoes. Edward couldn't bear it. He strode across the room. People instinctively moved aside. There was something in his aura, the impeccably tailored suit, the Italian wool overcoat, but mainly the expression on his face, and that screamed power. He was a shark entering a goldfish bowl. He reached the counter. The manager, noticing the approach of this distinguished man, changed his posture, trying to appear professional. "Yes, sir? Table for one?" Edward ignored the manager. He looked directly at the shouting customer. "The coffee was without sugar," Edward said, his voice calm, but with that steely tone that made executive directors tremble. "I saw it. You put the sachet in and forgot because you were shouting on the phone." The man blinked, confused. "Who are you?" "Someone who detests liars." Edward turned to the manager. "And you? Instead of protecting your employee, you prefer to humiliate her in front of everyone? Is that how you manage your team, through fear?" The manager stammered. "Sir, this is none of your business. She's my employee and—" "Not anymore," Edward cut him off. He looked at Louisa. She was paralyzed, holding a dirty cloth, looking at him as if he were a hallucination. "Mr. Ashton," she whispered, "get your things, Louisa, let's go." "But I can't. The money I need—" "The debt is paid." He lied, or perhaps it wasn't a lie. He would pay whatever was necessary. "Come on, now." Louisa hesitated. She looked at the manager, at the customer, at the crowded cafe. Then she looked at Edward, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't pity. It was solidarity. It was a safe harbor in the middle of the storm. She untied her apron, let it fall to the floor over the spilled coffee. "I quit," she told the manager, her voice weak but firm. Edward held out his hand. She didn't take it, but walked beside him. He placed his hand lightly on her back, guiding her out of that hell of noise and grease smell. When they stepped out onto the street, the cold night air felt like a balm. The rain continued, but Edward opened a large black umbrella sheltering her. "Get in the car," he said, opening the passenger door. Louisa got in, trembling. Edward walked around and took the wheel. He didn't start the car immediately. He sat in silence, listening to her ragged breathing beside him. You followed me?" she asked without looking at him. "I was worried. You disappeared. I needed money. My mother—" "I know." She turned her face to him, her eyes full of tears. "You know? You know everything? I know you are Louisa Nolan. I know you're trying to pay your mother's clinic bills. I know you're studying law late at night in my library." Louisa covered her face with her hands and cried. It was a contained, silent cry of someone who had learned not to make noise even in pain. Her body trembled. Edward waited. He let her pour out her emotions. When the sobs subsided, he spoke, looking at the rain on the windshield. "You don't have to do this alone, Louisa. No one can carry the world on their shoulders all the time." "I don't want charity," she said, her voice choked. "I don't want my father's money or anyone else's. I want to be myself." "And you are. What you did in there, enduring that for a greater goal, that's strength. But strength without strategy is wasted." He started the car. "Where are we going?" she asked, scared. "Home. My home." "I can't go back to work there, not after this. You know who I am." "Exactly. I know who you are, and that's why you won't be cleaning floors anymore." He drove off, gliding smoothly over the wet asphalt. "I have a guest room in the East Wing that isn't used. It's yours. You'll continue to live there, but not as a cleaning employee. I'll hire you as my junior personal assistant. You'll organize my library, my personal files. You'll have a decent salary, and you'll have time to study." "Why?" The question came out raw. "Why would you do that? My father, he tried to destroy you." Edward gripped the steering wheel. "Your father made his choices. You are making yours, and I am making mine." He glanced at her. "Let's just say I'm investing in an undervalued asset. I see potential in you, Louisa, and I never make a mistake in an investment." Louisa remained silent for the rest of the way, but when the car drove through the mansion gates and she saw the imposing house no longer as a place of forced labor, but as a possible refuge, she sighed. "Thank you," she whispered. Edward didn't answer, but inside he felt that that night's insomnia for the first time would not be empty. He had saved something, and in some strange way he felt he was saving himself too. Louisa's move to the East Wing guest room altered the mansion's emotional geography. What was once a mausoleum of silence and marble now had a pulse, however timid. Louisa accepted Edward's offer but set her own boundaries. She insisted on maintaining a strict work routine to justify her salary and lodging. She transformed the library, previously a repository of dusty books and forgotten documents, into her headquarters. She organized files, digitized old contracts, and catalogued the collection of rare works. She worked with the same silent efficiency as when she cleaned the floors, but now there was a different light in her eyes, the light of someone who had regained, however minimally, control over her own destiny. Edward observed this transformation with discreet fascination. He began dining at home more frequently, abandoning expensive restaurants and evening meetings. Sometimes he invited Louisa to sit at the table. Initially, she refused, preferring to eat in the kitchen with Matilda. But gradually her resistance ceded. The dinners were ceremonies of few words, but full of meaning. Edward spoke about the market, about the city, testing the waters. Louisa listened, attentive, and occasionally offered a perceptive comment on economics or politics that surprised Edward. The girl had her father's sharp mind, but without his arrogance. It was on a grey and cold Saturday afternoon that the past decided to knock again. Edward was in his office, reviewing some boxes of old documents that Louisa had separated for disposal or permanent archiving. They were papers from 10-15 years ago, projects that never materialized, correspondence from deceased partners, memories of a time when Ashton and Nolan was the promising giant of the north of England. At the bottom of a wooden box under a pile of yellowed accounting ledgers, Edward found a thick linen paper envelope with the Nolan family crest embossed dry. The envelope was sealed. It had never been opened. Edward frowned. He checked the postmark date, 3 months after the partnership breakup, 3 months after the scandal broke and Robert disappeared. He held the letter, feeling the weight of time. Why had he never received it? It had probably been withheld by his secretary at the time, instructed to filter any contact from Robert. Toxic waste, he called everything that came from his ex-partner in those days of fury. With slightly trembling hands, Edward picked up the silver letter opener and tore open the envelope. Inside, there were 3 handwritten pages, in Robert's broad, expansive script, but which, in certain sections, seemed to falter as if the pen weighed tons. Edward, I know you will probably never read this. I know you hate me, and you have every right to. I am not writing to ask for forgiveness, for what I did is unforgivable. Greed is a disease, my friend, and I was patient zero. I destroyed what we built. I destroyed my name, and worst of all, I destroyed my family's future. I write only so you know the truth about one thing, the pension fund embezzlement. It wasn't to buy yachts or houses in Europe, as the newspapers said. It was to cover a hole from a bad bet I made in the futures market, trying to multiply the company's capital without you knowing. I wanted to surprise you. I wanted to prove I could be as brilliant as you. Vanity, Edward. Damned vanity. I'm leaving. Helen no longer looks me in the face. Louisa, my little Louisa, she doesn't understand yet, but she will. And she will hate me. What kills me is not bankruptcy, Edward. It's knowing that I leave my daughter only shame. Take care. You were always the best of us two. Robert. Edward read the letter twice. Then he dropped the pages on the table and covered his face with his hands. For years he had fed the narrative that Robert was a calculating monster, a sociopath who stole for pleasure. But there in those crooked lines was only a weak man, devoured by his own insecurity and pathological need for approval. And Louisa, my little Louisa. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mr. Ashton? It was her voice. Edward raised his head. Louisa stood in the doorway, holding a folder. She saw his expression, saw the open letter on the table, saw the Nolan crest on the torn envelope. She paled. You found something about him. Edward didn't try to hide it. He picked up the letter and held it out to her. Sit down, Louisa. She entered, her legs stiff, and sat in the chair opposite him, the same one Walter had sat in days before to reveal her identity. She took the letter as if it were a ticking bomb. She read in silence. Edward watched tears form in her eyes, thick and heavy, but she didn't let them fall. She read to the end, took a deep breath, and returned the paper to the table. He was a fool, she said, her voice hard but choked. A vain fool. He was your father, Edward said softly. That doesn't absolve him. He destroyed our lives out of vanity, for wanting to compete with you. Do you hate him? Louisa looked at Edward. There was an old pain. In those eyes a wound that had never healed. I tried to hate him, it would be easier, but I can't. I just feel pity, and I feel angry for having to carry the weight of his choices. She stood up, agitated, and walked to the window, looking at the rain falling outside. When it all happened, I was 12. I remember the bailiffs taking the furniture. I remember my mother crying, locked in her room. I remember my school friends stopping talking to me, as if failure were contagious. I promised myself I would never ever depend on anyone, that I would never let anyone have that power over my life. She turned to him. That's why it's hard to accept your help, Edward. It's not pride, it's fear. Fear of trusting and seeing the ground disappear again. Edward stood up and went to her. He stood beside her, looking at the drenched garden. I understand, he said. I built walls around myself for the same reason. Not to depend, not to be vulnerable. And look at me, rich, powerful, and alone. Talking to the walls at 3 a.m. Louisa looked at him, surprised by the confession. The letter, Edward continued, it doesn't change what he did, but it changes how I see things. He erred out of weakness, not pure malice. And you are not him, Louisa. You have the strength he lacked. You think so? I'm sure. I saw you in that kitchen. I saw you in the cafe. I saw you studying in the early hours. Robert would never have done that. He fled. You stayed and fought. Louisa lowered her guard. Her shoulders relaxed. A solitary tear ran down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me, just continue. Finish your degree. Build your life. And if you need a foundation while you build, use this house, use this job. It's not charity, it's a partnership." He held out his hand to her, not as boss and employee, but as equals. Louisa looked at his hand, a strong hand, marked by time, the hand of the man who had been her father's best friend, and then his tormentor. But now it was just an offered hand. She shook his hand. The touch was firm, warm. "I accept the partnership," she said, and for the first time she offered a shy, genuine smile. In that moment something broke between them. The barrier of the past, made of grievances and silences, began to crumble, and in its place, a fragile but real bridge began to be built. Edward returned to his desk, feeling strangely light. Robert's letter was still there, but it no longer seemed like a document of accusation. It seemed like a closure. "Louisa," he called as she was leaving. "Yes? What do you think of dining out tonight, somewhere that doesn't serve coffee in plastic cups?" She smiled, a smile that lit up her tired face. "I'd love to, but I choose the place. I know a little Italian place in Ancoats that serves the best polenta in the city, and it's cheap." Edward laughed, a hoarse, rusty laugh he hadn't heard in years. Done. 8 o'clock. And as he watched her leave, Edward Ashton realized that the mansion, for the first time in a long time, didn't seem so big, nor so empty. 6 months had passed since that rainy night at the cafe. Manchester was now experiencing spring, and the golden laburnums colored the grey streets with explosions of life, a perfect reflection of what was happening inside the Ashton mansion. Louisa was no longer the shadow that glided through the corridors. She had become a vital presence. As Edward's personal assistant, she brought modern efficiency to his business, but more importantly, she brought humanity. She convinced him to create a scholarship program for low-income young people, financed by the company. She made him reconnect with his children in Europe, mediating video calls that started awkward and ended in laughter. But peace, as Edward well knew, is an interval between two storms. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a note in the city's most venomous social column. "The return of the cursed heiress. Sources confirm that Louisa Nolan, daughter of the infamous Robert Nolan, is living in Edward Ashton's mansion. Is it a romance of revenge or a masterstroke? The past, dear readers, never dies." Edward read the note on his tablet during breakfast. His face hardened. "Walter," he said on the phone seconds later, "find out who leaked this, and sue the newspaper, now." Louisa entered the dining room at that moment. She carried a stack of folders and a faint smile, which disappeared as soon as she saw Edward's expression. What happened? Edward tried to hide the tablet, but it was too late. Louisa picked up the device. She read the note. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just sighed, a long, tired sound. "I knew this would happen one day," she said, returning the tablet. "It's the price of my surname." "I'll fix this," Edward assured her, standing up. "I'll issue a statement denying everything. No," Louisa interrupted. Edward stopped. "What do you mean, no?" "Denying it will only increase curiosity. They'll dig deeper. They'll find out about the cleaning, about the cafe. They'll turn my struggle into a cheap soap opera." "And what do you suggest? That we let them talk?" "No, I suggest we tell the truth. My truth." Louisa walked to the window, looking at the laburnums in the garden. "I've spent the last 2 years running, Edward, hiding who I am, ashamed of what my father did. But you taught me something important that night at the cafe. Strength without strategy is wasted, and hiding is no longer a viable strategy." She turned to him. She was dressed in an elegant suit, her hair loose, her posture erect. She was no longer the frightened girl from the kitchen. She was a woman. "I want to give an interview, a single interview, to the most respected newspaper in the region. I'll tell everything, that I broke with my father, that I worked as a cleaner, that you gave me a job opportunity, not charity. I will own my narrative. Edward observed her with undisguised admiration. "Are you sure? This will expose you. It will expose your mother." "My mother is already exposed, and I'm ready. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Work dignifies. Isn't that what they say? I cleaned floors, I washed, dishes. So what? That doesn't diminish me. It built me." Edward smiled, a smile of paternal pride, but also of professional respect. "You are braver than I am, Louisa. Much braver." The interview was scheduled for the following week. The journalist, a respected veteran, was received in the mansion's library. Edward stayed nearby but did not interfere. He let Louisa shine, and she shone. She spoke calmly, clearly. She did not attack her father, but she did not defend him. She spoke about the pain of the fall, about the need to reinvent herself, about her gratitude for finding someone who believed in her when she didn't even believe in herself. "The Nolan surname carries a weight," she said at the end of the interview. "But I discovered that I don't have to carry that weight alone. And most importantly, I discovered that my name is not Nolan. My name is Louisa. And Louisa is who defines who I am." The article came out on Sunday. The repercussion was immense, but contrary to what the gossips expected, the public reaction was supportive. The story of the heiress who became a cleaner and rebuilt herself touched people. Louisa received invitations to speak, job offers, letters from admirers, but she refused everything. That night, after the whirlwind had passed, Edward and Louisa were on the veranda, drinking wine and watching the stars, which had finally appeared in the Manchester sky. "You won," Edward said, raising his glass. "We won," she corrected, toasting. "What will you do now? The world is at your feet." Louisa smiled, looking at the garden. "I'm going to finish my degree. I'm going to continue working here, if you still want me as an assistant, and I'm going to take care of my mother. The job is yours as long as you want it, but I think assistant no longer fits your position. How about social projects manager? I think the scholarship program needs someone with your life experience." Louisa laughed. "Accepted, but with a raise. Ruthless negotiator, it's in the blood." They laughed together. The sound echoed through the night, finally chasing away the silence that had haunted that house for so long. Edward looked at Louisa. He saw in her not only the friend's daughter, but the living proof that it is possible to start over. That, even when everything collapses, the foundations of character remain. And he, Edward Ashton, the man who had everything and had nothing, realized that by helping Louisa find herself, he had finally found himself too. Insomnia would not return that night, nor the next. Because now the house was full of stories, full of life, and full of future. Happiness, Louisa discovered, had a sweet taste, but a fragile texture. Like a crystal vase exposed to the wind, her new life in the Ashton mansion seemed perfect, gleaming, but she lived with the constant feeling that any sudden movement could shatter everything. 2 months had passed since the EUCU interview that changed her life. Spring in Manchester had given way to a mild summer with long days and cool nights. Louisa now officially held the position of Social Projects Manager at Ashton Logistics. She had her own office in the company building, a small but dedicated team, and a busy schedule of meetings with NGOs and community leaders. Edward, in turn, seemed to have rejuvenated 10 years. Louisa's presence in the house and the company had brought a new energy to him. Insomnia still visited him, but now it was an sporadic visit, no longer a permanent resident. They maintained a relationship of deep respect and almost paternal affection, although the city's gossip still tried, unsuccessfully, to insinuate something more. But the calm was about to end. It started with small signs. A car parked on the mansion's corner for too long, calls to the house's landline that went silent when someone answered, flowers delivered to the office without a card, only with a black funereal ribbon. Louisa tried to ignore it. It must be some curious person, she told herself, or some sensationalist journalist trying to create a story. But on a Tuesday night, the threats stopped being veiled. Louisa was alone in the mansion's library, finishing reviewing the budget for the renovation of a nursery in Moss Side. Edward had travelled to London for a board meeting, and would only return the next day. The house was silent, except for the sound of summer rain hitting the windows. The office phone rang. Louisa hesitated. It was almost 11 at night. Who would call at that hour? Perhaps Edward, saying his flight was delayed. She answered. Ashton Residence, good evening. On the other side, only heavy, drawn-out breathing. Hello? Louisa insisted, feeling a shiver down her spine. Louisa. The voice was hoarse, faltering as if coming from the bottom of a well. But it was unmistakable. Louisa's blood ran cold. The phone almost slipped from her hand. Father? There was a long silence, filled only by the static on the line. You've grown up, my daughter. I saw your picture in the newspaper. You look radiant. Louisa felt her stomach churn. She hadn't heard that voice in 3 years. The last time had been during a shouting match when she packed her bags to leave home. At the time, his voice was full of arrogance and fury. Now, it sounded weak, broken. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling but firm. How did you get this number? I'm your father, Louisa. Fathers always find a way. You stopped being my father the day you chose money over your family. The day you let Mum get sick with shame while you ran away. I know I made mistakes. The letter... Did you read the letter? Edward told me he gave it to you. Louisa felt a pang of betrayal. You spoke to Edward? No, not directly. I have my means. I know he's taking care. I know he's... of you. I know he's compensating for what he did to me. He didn't do anything to you, Louisa shouted, losing her composure. You destroyed yourself. Edward was the only person who offered me a hand when the whole world turned its back. He stole my life, Louisa. Robert's voice took on a sudden aggressive tone, an echo of the man he used to be. Ashton and Nolan was mine too. He took everything, the money, the prestige, and now my daughter. He took nothing that wasn't rightfully his, and I am no one's property. Listen, Louisa, I need to see you. No. Please, I don't have much time. The phrase hung in the air. I don't have much time. What did that mean? Illness? Threat? What does that mean? I'm in Manchester. I'm staying in a small hotel downtown near the coach station. Room 204, Esplanade Hotel. Come see me tomorrow, just us two. Don't tell Edward. I won't hide anything from him. If you tell him, I'll disappear. And you'll never know the truth about what really happened in that audit. The truth Edward hid from everyone, including you. You're lying again. Am I? Ask him, Louisa. Ask your savior about the account in the Cayman Islands that was in his name, not mine. Ask him why he was never investigated. Louisa fell silent. Doubt, a cursed seed, was planted. Tomorrow, at 10. If you don't come, I'll disappear forever, and I'll take the truth with me. The line went dead. Louisa dropped the phone into the cradle, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at the library, at the books Edward had bought for her, at the office he had set up. Everything suddenly seemed unstable. Had Edward lied? Had he framed Robert to save his own skin? No, it couldn't be. Edward was a man of integrity. She had seen his kindness, his loneliness. A guilty man wouldn't take in the victim's daughter. Or would he? Was guilt the engine of all that generosity? Louisa spent the night awake. She walked around the house, looked at old photos, reread the documents she had organized. She found nothing that incriminated Edward. But the doubt persisted, fueled by her father's ghostly voice. When the day dawned, rainy and grey, Louisa made a decision. She would go to the meeting, not to betray Edward, but to look her father in the eyes and know once and for all who was the real villain of her story. She put on a discreet coat, took a taxi at the corner so as not to use the company car, and went to the coach station. The Esplanade Hotel was a decaying building with a peeling facade and a neon sign with burnt-out letters. Louisa climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of mold and cigarettes permeating the air. She stopped in front of room 204. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to echo in the empty hallway. She raised her hand to knock. But before her knuckles touched the wood, the door creaked open. "Come in, Louisa," said the voice from inside. She pushed the door open. The room was small, dark. lit only by the grey light entering through the dirty window. Sitting in an old armchair with his back to the light was Robert Nolan, but it wasn't the man she remembered. The arrogant giant in Italian suits was gone. In his place was a thin, aged man with yellowish skin and clothes too large for his skeletal body. He held a cane with trembling hands. Louisa stopped at the door, shock catching in her throat. "Father?" Robert turned his face to her. His eyes were sunken, but shone with a feverish intensity. "Hello, my daughter. Thank you for coming." He tried to smile, but the gesture was a grimace of pain. "What happened to you?" Louisa asked, forgetting for a second her anger and accusations. "Life happened, Louisa. Life charges dearly from those who try to deceive it." He pointed to a rickety wooden chair. "Sit down. We have a lot to talk about, and little time." Louisa entered and closed the door. The sound of the lock turning seemed to seal her fate. She was there alone with the ghost that had haunted her nightmares for years, and for the first time she felt that the danger came not from his strength, but from his weakness, and from the words he was about to say. "You said Edward lied," she began, remaining standing. "Prove it." Robert let out a dry laugh, which ended in a cough. "Direct as ever. You get that from your mother." He reached into the pocket of his shabby coat and pulled out a small black USB stick. "Here it is, copies of emails, transfers, recorded conversations, everything that proves Edward knew about the embezzlements. He didn't participate, Louisa, but he knew, and he let it happen. He used me as a scapegoat to clean up the company before going public. He let me fall so he could rise." Louisa looked at the USB stick, such a small object, capable of destroying everything she had built in recent months. "Why now?" she asked. "Why give me this now?" "Because I'm going to die, Louisa." The confession came out simple, without drama. "Pancreatic cancer. I have months, maybe weeks. I don't want money. I don't want revenge. I just want you to know who the man is who sleeps under the same roof as you." He held out the USB stick. "Take it. Do what you want with it. Throw it away. Give it to the police. Confront him. The choice is yours. But don't live in a lie, my daughter. A lie is a poison that slowly kills us. I am living proof of that." Louisa looked at her father's hand. She looked at his face, devastated by illness and regret. And then she thought of Edward, the man who had rescued her, in the cafe, the man who had given her books and dignity. She reached out and took the USB stick. The metal was cold. "I'll see what's on here," she said, "but if it's a lie, if it's another one of your manipulations, I swear, Father, I will never utter your name again." Robert nodded, tired. "Fair enough. Now go. The smell of this place is not good for you." Louisa left the room without looking back. She ran down the stairs, needing air. She stepped out onto the street, into the rain, and took a deep breath, feeling the taste of pollution and Manchester's dampness. In her coat pocket, the USB stick weighed like an anchor. She had the truth in her hand, or the final lie of a desperate man. Either way, peace in the Ashton mansion was numbered. The USB stick burned in Louisa's pocket like a live ember. She returned to the Ashton mansion, but didn't go in immediately. She stood in the garden under the fine rain, looking at the imposing facade of the house she had learned to call home. Was it all a lie? The conversations, the support, the trust, was Edward just a talented actor, playing the role of benefactor to atone for an unspeakable guilt? She entered through the service door, avoiding crossing paths with Matilda. She went straight to her room, locked the door, and sat down in front of her personal laptop. Her hands trembled so much that she entered the wrong password twice. Finally, she connected the USB stick. A folder opened on the screen. Truth Dossier, Louisa clicked. There were dozens of files, PDFs of bank statements, audio recordings of meetings, copies of emails. She started reading. The documents showed complex financial movements between Ashton and Nolan, and offshore companies in the Caribbean. The dates coincided with the period of the embezzlements that condemned Robert. But in the documents on the USB stick, the digital signature authorizing the transfers was not Robert's. It was an alphanumeric code linked to an EA Invest account, Edward Ashton. Louisa felt the air leave her lungs. She opened an audio file. It was a poor recording, full of noise, but the voices were clear. "We need to isolate Robert, Edward. He's asking too many questions about the railway contracts," an unknown voice said. "Leave Robert to me. He's vain. I'll give him enough rope to hang himself. When the audit comes, he'll be the only one to blame," Edward's voice replied. Younger, colder, but undeniably his. Louisa ripped off her headphones as if they had shocked her. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and started pacing the room, her hands on her head. It can't be, Edward knew. Edward planned. He used her father's ambition as a weapon to eliminate him and take the empire for himself. And then, years later, he had taken in the victim's daughter as a trophy of his clean conscience. Nausea rose in Louisa's throat. She felt dirty, used. Every smile, every piece of advice, every gesture of affection from Edward now seemed like grotesque manipulation. She needed to get out of there. She needed to flee. But where? To her dying father in a cheap hotel? To the loneliness of the streets? No. Fleeing was what the old Louisa would do. The new Louisa, the woman Edward had helped forge, supreme irony, did not flee. She confronted. She waited. Edward arrived from his trip in the early evening. Louisa heard the car enter the garage, heard the front door open, heard his voice greeting Matilda. She went downstairs. Edward was in the hall, taking off his overcoat. He looked tired but smiled when he saw her. "Louisa, glad you're here. The meeting in London was hell, but I managed to close the—" He stopped. The smile died on his lips when he saw her expression. Louisa stood on the last step of the staircase, holding the USB stick in her raised hand. "What's that?" he asked, his voice cautious. "The truth," Louisa replied. "Or at least the version of it you forgot to tell me." Edward looked at the USB stick, then into her eyes. He didn't ask what was on it. He knew. His shoulders slumped as if an invisible weight had been placed upon them. "Where did you get that?" "My father. He's in the city, Edward, dying. And before he dies, he decided to give me what you denied me, the full story." Edward sighed. He walked to the living room and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't offer her one. He took a long sip, his back to her. "Your father was always good at half-truths," he said, without turning around. "Half-truths?" Louisa descended the steps and entered the room. "I heard your voice, Edward. I saw the statements. You knew about the embezzlements. You planned to bring him down." Edward turned around. His face was pale, but his eyes did not waver. "Yes, I knew." The confession hit Louisa like a slap. "You admit it, just like that, without even trying to deny it." "Deny what for? You've already seen the evidence." He placed the glass on the table forcefully. "But what your father didn't tell you, Louisa, is why. There's no why that justifies destroying a family. There is when that family is about to destroy thousands of others." Edward raised his voice for the first time. "Robert wasn't just embezzling money to cover bets, Louisa. He was laundering money for organized crime. He was using our truck fleet to transport things that shouldn't have been there." Louisa recoiled, shocked. "That's a lie. It's the truth." Edward walked up to her, stopping a meter away. "I found out 6 months before the audit. I tried to confront him, tried to make him stop. He laughed in my face, said I was scared, that I had no vision, said if I opened my mouth he would kill me. And kill my family." Louisa shook her head, stunned. "I couldn't go to the police without concrete evidence. And if I did, the company would be shut down, thousands of employees would lose their jobs. And I would probably be arrested too, as an accomplice. So I did the only thing I could. I set a trap. I let him believe he was in control, while I documented his financial embezzlements. I used his greed against him." "And the recording?" Louisa asked, her voice weak. "You said you'd give him enough rope to hang himself." "Yes, I did. It was a conversation with the head of security, the only one I trusted. I needed Robert to fall for the financial crimes, Louisa, because if he fell for drug trafficking, we would all be dead. His partners don't forgive." Edward ran a hand over his face, exhausted. I protected him, Louisa. I protected you. I protected your mother. If the truth about the trafficking had come out, you wouldn't have just lost your money. You would have lost your lives. Louisa sat on the sofa, her legs giving way. The world spun. Two narratives collided in her mind. The father, victim of a corporate coup. The criminal father, protected by a desperate partner. Why did you never tell me? She whispered. How could I? Come to a 12-year-old girl and say, your father is a dangerous criminal. I preferred to let you believe he was just a financial failure. It was less painful. And then, when you came here, I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, the hatred you felt for him would turn against me too, for having hidden it. He knelt before her, getting to her eye level. I'm not a Saint Louisa. I played dirty. I manipulated. But I did it to save the company and to save the people I loved. And that included Robert, despite everything. He was arrested for fraud, served a semi-open sentence, and disappeared. If it had been for trafficking, he would have died in prison in the first week. Louisa looked at Edward. She saw the wrinkles on his face, the old sadness in his eyes. She saw the truth there, not the cold truth of documents, but the human truth, complex and painful. He's dying, she said. Cancer. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. I'm sorry. He wants me to hate you. He gave me this so I would destroy you. He was always vengeful, even to the end. Louisa looked at the USB stick in her hand, the weapon her father had given her. What do I do now? Edward stood up and reached out his hand to her, but not to take the USB stick, just to offer support. You do what you think is right, Louisa. You own your story now. If you want to go to the police, go. If you want to go to the press, go. I won't stop you. I'm tired of keeping secrets. Louisa looked at the USB stick. Then she looked at the lit fireplace in the corner of the room. She stood up, walked to the fire, and threw the USB stick into the flames. The plastic melted, crackling. The metal darkened. Robert's truth turned to smoke. It's over, she said. The past is over. Edward looked at her, surprised and moved. Louisa, I'm not doing this for you, Edward. I'm doing it for me. I won't carry his hatred. I won't be the tool of his revenge. He chose his path. I choose mine. She turned to Edward. But we have one thing to do together. What? He's dying alone in a dirty hotel. He was a terrible father, a terrible partner, and apparently a criminal. But he's a human being, and we are better than him. Edward understood. He nodded, picking up his car keys. Let's go get him. That night, Edward Ashton's armored car crossed the city again, but this time it wasn't to rescue a runaway girl. It was to rescue the man who had caused the flight. The cycle was closing, and the price of blood finally was being paid with mercy. Robert Nolan's arrival at the Ashton mansion was a silent, almost clandestine event. There was no press, no fanfare, just a private ambulance entering through the back gates on a foggy pre-dawn. Edward set up a home care structure in the annex, the same place where Louisa used to hide to cry in her first days of work. Now, the place was transformed into a luxury hospital room, with 24-hour nurses and equipment monitoring Robert's increasingly weak vital signs. Louisa visited her father every day. At first, the conversations were tense, monosyllabic. Robert, even, debilitated, tried to maintain the pose of the wronged man. But the proximity of death has a peculiar way of eroding masks. In the second week, he cried. He apologized not for the money, but for having missed her childhood. He spoke of how he regretted not having gone to her ballet performance at age 10 because he had a meeting with investors, whom Louisa now knew to be traffickers. Edward, in turn, maintained a respectful distance. He paid the bills, supervised the treatment, but avoided entering the room. His presence there would be an affront, or perhaps too painful, a reminder of what they had both lost. But on a Sunday afternoon, Robert asked to see him. Louisa went to call Edward in the office. He wants to talk to you. Edward hesitated. I don't know if it's a good idea, Louisa. It's the last chance, Edward. The doctor said he won't make it past tonight. Edward nodded. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the annex. Louisa stayed outside, sitting on the garden bench, looking at the ancient pines. She didn't need to hear what they would say. That conversation belonged only to the two men who had shaped her life, one by absence and error, the other by presence and correction. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and withered flowers. Robert lay pale, his breathing noisy. He opened his eyes when Edward entered. "You've aged, Ashton," Robert whispered with a weak smile. "And you've gotten thinner, Nolan," Edward replied, sitting in the chair beside the bed. There was a long silence, not the awkward silence from before, but a heavy silence, laden with decades of history. "She burned the USB stick," Robert said. "My daughter, she burned the evidence." "I know. She's loyal to you, more than she ever was to me." "She's loyal to herself, Robert. She did what she thought was right." Robert closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. "I wanted to destroy you, Edward. Until the last minute, I wanted to see you on the ground. But now, looking at her, seeing the woman she's become, I realize you did what I couldn't. You took care of her." Edward leaned forward. "I didn't do it for you, Robert. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because, in some strange way, she saved me, too." Robert extended his skeletal hand. Edward held it. The grip was weak, but significant. "Thank you," Robert said. "And I'm sorry. For the mess. For the greed. For everything." "You're forgiven," Edward replied. And to his own surprise, he felt it was true. The hatred had evaporated. Only pity and an understanding of human fragility remained. Robert died that dawn, just before sunrise. Louisa was holding his hand. Edward was at the door, watching over their sleep. The burial was discreet. Only Louisa, Edward, Walter, and a few old acquaintances who still dared to show up. There was no scandal in the press, just a respectful note about the former businessman's passing. In the days that followed, the Ashton mansion underwent a new transformation. The grief was there, yes, but it was a clean grief, without loose ends. The shadow of the past had finally dissipated. A week later, Louisa entered Edward's office. She was carrying a cardboard box. "What's that?" he asked. "My father's things. I found them in his suitcase at the hotel. Old photos, letters from my mother. And this." She pulled an old deed from inside the box. "It's the deed to the first Ashton. A Nolan headquarters. That old warehouse in Salford where it all began. He kept it all these years." Edward took the document, moved. Why would he keep this? Because deep down, it was the only time he was truly happy. Before the money, before the greed, when they were just two friends dreaming of conquering the world. Louisa smiled, a sad but serene smile. "I'll keep the photos, but I think this belongs to you." Edward put the deed in his drawer, along with the letter Robert had written years earlier. "Thank you, Louisa." "Edward," she hesitated. "I was thinking, my mother, she's getting better. The doctors say she might be discharged from the clinic soon." "That's great. I'd like to bring her here, not to live, of course, but for lunch, for her to see that everything is okay, that we survived." Edward smiled. "The house is yours, Louisa. Bring anyone you want." Louisa walked up to him and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you for being the father I needed when mine couldn't be." She left the office, leaving the door open. Sunlight entered the hallway, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. Edward Ashton stood up and went to the window. He looked at the city of Manchester, stretching out beyond, vibrant and alive. He no longer felt the weight of loneliness. He no longer felt the chill of insomnia. He had a daughter, not by blood, but by soul. And he had a future to build, no longer based on ambition but on legacy. The story of shadows was over. Now it was time to live in the light. 1 year, 365 days, for the history of humanity, a mere breath. For For Louisa's history, an eternity. The Bridgewater Hall was packed. The buzz of hundreds of families, the scent of flowers and expensive perfumes, the flash of cameras. On stage, the orchestra tuned its instruments, creating that anxious cacophony that precedes great moments. Louisa adjusted the black gown over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, solemn. She looked at her reflection in the makeshift dressing room mirror backstage. The face that stared back no longer had the dark circles of the girl who washed dishes in the early hours, nor the fear of the fugitive hiding in cheap boarding houses. It was the face of a woman who knew the weight of her own story and had chosen to carry it with elegance. "Nervous?" a voice asked behind her. Louisa smiled at the reflection. Edward stood in the doorway, impeccable in a charcoal grey suit. He held a bouquet of white orchids. "A little," she admitted, turning around. "Speaking to a graduating class is harder than negotiating with the dockworkers' union." Edward laughed. "You'll ace it. You have the gift of gab, Louisa. Always have. You just needed someone to listen." He handed her the flowers, for the class valedictorian. "Thank you, Edward, for everything. Don't start crying now, or you'll smudge your makeup and Matilda will kill me. She spent an hour doing that eyeliner." Louisa laughed, holding back tears. "Where is she?" "In the front row, next to your mother. They're both competing to see who cries more. I think Helen is winning, but Matilda has a linen handkerchief that's a secret weapon." Louisa's heart warmed. Her mother, Helen Nolan. A year ago, she was a sedated shadow in a clinic. Today, she lived in a comfortable apartment in Chorlton, paid for with the money from the sale of the farm, the only property that remained and which Louisa had managed to recover legally. Helen still had difficult days when the memory of Robert hurt, but they were increasingly rare. She had returned to painting, an old hobby that the unhappy marriage had stifled. "Shall we?" Edward offered his arm. "Your audience awaits." Louisa linked her arm through his. They walked through the theatre corridors, the sound of applause growing like a wave. When her name was announced, Louisa Nolan, valedictorian of the law class, the theatre erupted. Louisa walked onto the stage, feeling the spotlight on her face. She looked out at the dark audience, but she knew exactly where they were. Her family. The family that fate had broken and that love had mended. She took a deep breath and began. "They say that law is the art of seeking justice," she said, her firm voice echoing through the hall. "But I learned the hard way that justice is not just a concept in books. Justice is what we do when no one is looking. It is the choice to extend a hand instead of turning our backs. It is the courage to forgive when the world demands revenge." She saw Edward in the front row, discreetly wiping his eyes. She saw her mother smiling, proud. "We graduates leave here today with a diploma in hand, but the real test will not be in the courts or in the offices. It will be in life. It will be when we have to decide between the easy path and the right path, between profit and dignity, between silence and truth." Louisa paused. "I dedicate this diploma to two men. One who taught me, through pain, what I did not want to be, and another who taught me, through example, what I could become. The past is a shadow, yes, but it is the light we choose to ignite today that defines the size of that shadow, and I choose the light." The applause was deafening. Louisa descended from the stage, not only as a bachelor of law, but as the undisputed protagonist of her own life. The celebration party was at the Ashton mansion, but it was not one of those rigid, silent dinners of old. The garden was lit with strings of lights. There was live music, a soft jazz trio, and waiters circulated with trays of canapes. There were people from all of Louisa's worlds. Her college colleagues, the office team, the scholarship students from the social project she had created. And of course Edward, Helen, and Matilda, presiding over the main table like the patriarchs of that improbable tribe. Louisa walked through the garden, champagne glass in hand, receiving hugs and congratulations. She stopped near the stone fountain, where the water sang its eternal song. Edward approached. "Lovely party," he said. "The best," she agreed. "I have a present for you, another one." He took an envelope from his pocket. "What is it? Another old deed?" "No, it's a ticket for London." Louisa's eyes widened. London? My children, Beatrice and James. They saw the video of your speech. I sent it to them live. They want to meet you, and they want me to come along. Edward looked up at the starry sky. It's been 5 years since I saw my children in person, Louisa. 5 years of excuses, of meetings, of fear. You gave me back the courage to be a father. So, I'd like you to come with me. As part of the family. Louisa felt her throat tighten. Edward, You don't have to answer now. The trip is next month, but know that for me you are already my daughter, no matter the surname. Louisa hugged Edward, a strong, prolonged hug, where no more words were needed. I'll go, she whispered. Of course I'll go. They stood there, embracing, while the music played and the party revolved around them. At the top of the mansion, the window of Louisa's old room was open. Light streamed in, illuminating the books on the shelf, the diploma on the table, the photo of Robert and Helen together, young and happy, which she had rescued. There were no more ghosts in that house. There was no more insomnia. There was only tomorrow, and it was bright.